And hello everybody, welcome to the final week of Generative AI for Journalists. That's right, we're now in the final week, isn't that crazy? We've done 4 modules so far in this class, introducing Retrieval Augmented Generation, or RAG for short, through the frame of what can you do with your data, making data useful with language models, etc. And to recap a little bit, because we are now in the final week of this course, congratulations by the way, in the first week, we took a look at what language models are, and what data modeling is, and what algorithms are, etc. In the second week, we looked at ways to make our data machine readable. That is, to take a whole bunch of PDFs and CSVs and text files, etc., split them up, and embed every single one. And to embed is to turn the document into numbers, which are readable by a language model. And not only to do that, but also to store those numbers and documents combined into a whole bunch of little vector stores. A vector store is like a database that holds numbers and documents together in one place. And what it allows you to do, together with an embedding language model, is look up relevant documents for some kind of query. So if you have a whole bunch of recipes in a vector store and you wanted to find a recipe for cookies, you look up cookie, and the vector store will retrieve the most relevant documents. Then, in the third week, last week, we took our vector store, we turned it into a tool, and we passed it off to a language model, creating an agent. An agent, to recap, is a language model that has a tool which allows it to retrieve relevant information to answer a user's question. And so, what we did last week was we took 3 different data sources. That is open data for my local city. That is Supreme Court opinion material. And that is community information regarding Hamilton, Ontario, so population, statistics, etc. And we took all 3 kinds of documents, we embedded them, stuck them to a vector store, and then we asked the language model specific questions. And it was able to look up the most relevant documents and return to us the answer. Now, in our final week of the course, we'll be looking at making our language model, our agent, more publicly accessible. And that involves making a website. And to do that, we'll be looking at ways to implement a front end more specifically. So a website in the parlay of web development is really like a front end, and our data is the back end. You can imagine our agent and the way of using our agent and the whole data and everything all bundled together as being like an application. And applications are composed of 2 parts. The front end, which the user interacts with, so that might be like, say, like a window and different little buttons and search bars and documents that you scroll through, etc. And then in the back end, you have the program logic and you have data. So you have data from your hard drive, you have data from the internet, and then logic for putting that data together and then passing it off to the front end to be displayed to the viewer. So a front end and a back end paradigm is how web development is typically thought of. So language models you can think of as like the program logic. So last week we introduced agents as being like a reasoning engine. They look at sources of information, they think of ways to compose those sources together in order to answer a complex question. So that's really like in the back end. And a data is also in the back end. So really last week, in a sense, we are looking at making the back end of a web application. We have a program logic, which is our language model, and the tools that it has been given, and then our data. But in the front end, we'll now be looking at making a website. So ChatGPT, one of the reasons why it was really successful was because it was really accessible. GPT-3, you had to use in a command line, generally speaking, so there was no convenient chatting interface, like you chat with someone in Messenger, or iMessage, or WhatsApp. Rather, GPT-3 was quite literally a word prediction algorithm that ran in a terminal. So you type in a few words, and then it continues the words that you typed in realistically. That wasn't very useful for chatting. In fact, there was no natural ability for GPT-3 to chat. But ChatGPT, after it was been undergone reinforcement learning to become more chat-like and good at chatting specifically, a research team at OpenAI threw together a beta of the ChatGPT website. And it did nothing but structure and make very presentable your conversation with ChatGPT. So in a way, ChatGPT's interface was a big part of its success, because without it, you wouldn't be able to just naturally chat with ChatGPT like you're on WhatsApp. So we'll be doing the same thing today. And we'll be doing that with a library called Gradio. Gradio is a Hugging Face library. Hugging Face is a major AI startup. This week we'll be talking to Freddie Bolton, who is a developer at Hugging Face. He works on Gradio, and he'll be telling us more about what Gradio is for, what it does, and who uses it. But quickly, Gradio allows us to make convenient front ends, like a chatting interface, using only a few lines of code. And then we can put up Gradio interfaces up on Hugging Face as a Hugging Face space, which I'll introduce in just a moment. So Hugging Face, to step back a little bit, is an AI startup that has received lots of money, but they're not a normal AI startup. It's not like Meta or OpenAI or Cohere. It's not like what Google is doing with Bard. Rather, it's an open source company. Everything they do is open source. They release libraries for running language models in Python. They release libraries like Gradio for making front ends for your code, and they host everything for free on their website. And in fact, the copy of Mistral that you downloaded this week, and that you'll likely download again this week, was taken from Hugging Face. So it's also a repository for language file models. So it's also a repository for language model files. Hugging Face is pretty convenient if you're looking into getting into language models locally. But there is a word of note here. Language models, when you put them online, are not necessarily secure. The reason why what we did last week was secure, and if you have any sensitive information that you might have stuck into the folder, the reason why nobody else is able to get a look at that is because it's running all on your own computer, or in Google Collaboratory. This is not necessarily the case if you give other people access to your agent. If other people have access to your agent, and they will after this module is finished, they might be able to look at your data if you want them to. And if you care a lot about security, it's important to keep this in mind.